Inconnues. Donc on va découvrir ça avec vous sur le Foresight Fictional Intelligence. Voilà, je vous laisse la parole.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Is yours live too?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. So, fictional intelligence. We're here to talk about it a little bit today, and we did this once this morning, which was in a quite different setting from this. So, we want to put you to work a little bit today too. We'll do some brainstorming. So, please be prepared to sort of contribute as we progress through a group brainstorming. The objective of which will be a jointly authored by all of us sort of FICINT scenario. But at this point, let's back up a little bit and first tell you what we mean by that. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is James Reese, Jim Reese. You can tell from the accent, American, a native New Yorker. So I like to say that because those of you who are participating in a second, third, ninth language will realize, as you already have, that I speak English rather quickly. My colleague here speaks English even faster than I do, but we will try to modulate that somewhat, although that's a lie. We never managed to do that, but we'll try. And if ever anything is just a little confusing or you've lost the thread, let us know, okay? So James Reese, call me Jim. In addition to working at the École de Guerre, which I do along with my partner here, Nafkote, both of us oversee different groups in the U.S. academic writing module. So what we do there is those officers who have to audition, who have decided and have auditioned and been accepted into a program in which they work with a US-based institution, a think tank, a university. We work with the Carnegie Engagement for International Peace. We work with the Harvard Kennedy School. And they do a months-long research project that eventuates in a trip to DC where they present their findings. So that we both teach in the U.S. academic writing program. And in addition to that, a couple of years ago, this was really a bottom-up initiative that started with an officer who had an interest in the burgeoning field of FICINT. That led to us launching the FICINT module here at the École de Guerre. So, in addition to teaching here, both of us are published creative writers. I've published 5 novels, currently trying to sell my 6th and finish my 7th. Squarely in what we might call the neo-Gothic, so something rather distant from the FICINT we're talking about today, but of course, at base, it's all about storytelling. So in addition to teaching here, I also teach the Gothic novel and film adaptation at Sciences Po. But of primary interest to us here today is what we do with FICINT, what FICINT is here at the War College and elsewhere. And then we're going to walk you through the steps of it. So before I ask Nafkote to introduce herself, that's what today is going to look like, okay? So 20 minutes sort of theoretical, 20 minutes of brainstorming, and then another 50 minutes of a group brainstorm where we will try to come up with a FICINT scenario. Again, we're going to walk you through the steps of that. Don't let that be as intimidating as it may sound. Sounds intimidating to me as I say it. But we'll teach you some of the tricks that we use to do that here. But first, I'll let Nafkote introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. My name is Nafkote Tamrat, as James mentioned. And as he also mentioned, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. But as you probably can tell from my name, yes? Are you sure?
Don't get, yeah, we're
okay.
getting...
Is this okay?
A little bit more. Just don't touch it.
Like this?
More.
How dare you? How dare you? Don't mock me, New York. So I'm from Boston, but my name obviously is not a typically American name. My family is of Ethiopian origin, and I've written one novel that came out in 2018. My second novel will come out in January 2026, and I write mostly in speculative fiction. So we'll talk a little bit about how FICINT borrows from speculative fiction, but I write mostly about the Ethiopian diaspora, and I use speculative fiction and kind of science fiction themes to talk a little bit about the alienation and distancing that one might feel coming from a country that is so different from the country, so a country of destination that differs from a country of origin, and so using science fiction to try to make more concrete those ideas and those themes of distance, of isolation, of homecoming. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that when we get into FICINT itself, which, for those of you who don't know, FICINT is a blending of the words fictional and intelligence, and it's a tool of strategic foresight. Now, it's been used, and we have certainly used it with professionals from different fields and different areas of expertise. I'll let Jim talk a little bit later about how we use it here at the École de Guerre. But what fictional intelligence is in practice, beyond that, is using storytelling methods and tropes to try to intelligently and with grounded research predict or have some sort of foresight into what our fields, what our areas of interest, what our professions might yield in the years to come. So it's very different from science fiction and from fantasy, even though it does borrow some genre tropes from them. The main difference is that within FICINT, we try to keep our stories focused within a 10 to 15 year period into the future. And why we do that is we want to really make sure that we can try to use those stories to come up with solutions and possibilities that are realistic now, right? That we can really look forward and think about and understand. So what that means is, unlike in science fiction, you can't invent something wholesale that we don't have the technology for example, right? That's not very useful in terms of how you might be able to apply this for your work and for your field. And it's also a matter of accountability, right? So if we go beyond 10, 15 years, it stops becoming our problem and becomes the problem of the next generation. So we really want to think about, in the career path we have, what can we start doing now that might alter the possibilities of future outcomes. And we use storytelling not just because it's nice, but also because storytelling is one of the oldest tools in our arsenal, right, as human beings. We're far more likely to pay attention, we're far more likely to care if it affects human beings who we recognize as being close to us, right? So part of it is not just for you having that foresight tool, it's also being able to hopefully get new readers who will be able to understand what you're talking about, even if they don't have your professional background, and will probably be crucial to any solution that you come up with, right? Very unlikely that we'll be siloed into our different professions. We'll probably need to collaborate with other people, be they, lay people in far different fields, or ones that we'll see are intersecting. So that's FICINT in a general theoretical nutshell, but I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk about how we use it here at the War School.
Yeah, and we should say too that there's a panel, we're part of a 4-person panel tomorrow afternoon, where we will be joined by someone working in strategic foresight for the government, talking more about red team initiatives, et cetera, and also someone, a former student of ours, who's talking about how FICINT has informed his military career since he's learned about it and is actually incorporating it into his work in human resources within the Army.
Yes.
Or the Navy.
No, Army.
The Army. So that's tomorrow.
No,
Sorry. So tomorrow will be a little bit more of an occasion to talk a bit more about theory, but we want to focus today on the actual practicalities, more of a workshop and the logistics of how we do this, because this is a quite new genre. You'll see that, as Nefkote said, it borrows a lot from existing genres, but yet it is something new too. And I don't think people have been hearing the term FICINT going back 5 or 6 years, I think maybe where it first came about. Which is where, as I said previously or earlier, we had an officer say, hey, this is out there. This would be cool for us. And credit to our higher-ups here who decided that there was a role for this in PME, professional military education. And so we have been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. So what exactly do we do? Depending on the calendar, which is always a sticky point, we're given 10 or 12 sessions. Non-consecutive, they happen to be typically here on a rather rigid calendar, Friday afternoons, which serves us well. People are a little bit more relaxed. And I say that because this is something that, we're dealing with high-achieving people here in the military at this level, the level at which we teach, and asking them to do something they've never done before is intimidating. So we're asking them, a lot of the officers come to us and they're well read in various related fields, perhaps sci-fi or something, but very few of them have tried to write. So we understand that can be a little bit intimidating for them. And we're going to tell you today about some, again, I'll say tricks, which is a terrible word, but some structure and some ways that we present for entree into the creative process. So over these 10 or 12 class sessions, what we do, we have it this is under the aegis of the English department here, so let me bear that in mind. So there's always that we're working on their English as well. But what we do is we read stories together. We take the first 3 sessions or so to talk about stories. This year we've used an anthology of speculative fiction. But the further we get in this process, the more we realize is out there to use, meaning more and more people are working sort of on FICINT things. The UK has a very interesting program. The US is doing it. Of course, it's being done not just in English, but English is what we would be using here. So we have stories where everyone will read the same story. 2 officers will lead the group in discussion leading, open-ended discussion leading of the stories, where we'll be trying to analyze the stories for content, but also to understand how a story might work, which is, again, the biggest mystery. More about that in a moment. Then, as the officers get more comfortable reading stories, talking about the stories, sort of critiquing the stories, looking at them for structure, development, etc., they will then start to workshop their own stories. And a word here briefly about what we mean by story. So, yes, it can be a 5 to 7 page short story, because they have to draft it, they have to present it for workshopping, get feedback, do a revision, so it's a lengthy sort of process. But the form, I think this is an interesting thing about FICINT, the form, we're open to anything. So we've had interesting stories done that were gaming scenarios, film scripts, one that was written as an obituary, another that is, the format is a psychological assessment of an officer suffering from PTSD. So form is wide open in this field, which again is, I think, an exciting part of it. So we do the readings, we do the workshopping, and then a lot of brainstorming individually, because a big part of the int, again, fiction and intelligence, the int, the data that has to be real world data, it's very interesting for us because the only expertise we bring to this is from the fictional side. We rely on the officers to bring the int to us, is to do periodic brainstorming about what kind of int is of interest to them. What are they thinking about now? Because what we're thinking about now, what do we know about it now? And then how do we cast into the future and try to deal with it? So again, why do we do this in the first place? To reiterate some of what Navkote said, is in the hopes of creating, I'll say message, but again, that's too direct a term. Creating something that is both engaging as a work of art for the reader, but also will, because it engages the reader differently, or the audience, can have a different sort of impact. So if you have a certain sort of intelligence and you write a memo or a white paper or a letter or something, we're sort of inured to those. We know the impact of that, and we're already sort of at a distance because of the form. So if you try to do that in a story, and again, we're going to walk through the processes of how we do this here, the hope is that it has a far greater impact. So one of the other things we do, our brainstorming session, again, this mirrors what we'll do today. We do something, we call it creative collaboration, somewhat of an oxymoron in terms of that term, but we do a jointly authored story. So we start brainstorming something, and then each officer contributes a page or two to this story that's ongoing, which is an interesting way to think about creativity. It's an interesting way to approach the FICINT. It's a very interesting way to think about the structure of story. So I'm going to turn it back over to Navkote to tell you a little bit more about what that looks like when we do it with the officers.
So for this creative collaboration, we use a technique that you are, I'm sure most, if not all of you, familiar with, which is called the exquisite corpse. So for those who might not be familiar, this was a popular parlor game created by the Surrealists, and in its original form, you would be sitting around a table and you take a piece of paper. One person would draw a small illustration at the top, fold the paper down, pass it on to the next person. They would draw an image, you fold the paper down, and by the time you get back to the beginning of the circle, when you unfold it, you've created a creature, a project, a mythological collaboration, right, that you couldn't have done if it was just one person. So we try to take that same idea, that same theory, and we apply it to text. So what we do is at the beginning of the term in FICINT, one of us will start with a paragraph, and before then we will have done the brainstorming that we're going to do today, so we'll know, generally speaking, this is the geographical location we want to focus in. These are the issues that we want to make sure we come to. This is our protagonist, crucially. And then we'll begin with a couple of paragraphs. and then we'll pass it on to the next person on the list. And then by the time we get to the end, we've come up with a more or less coherent, cogent story. Now, that's interesting because there are two things that come about from that. One is that we all have different areas of interest when it comes to creativity. Some people are much more interested in creating characters. For some, it's really plot that gets you going, right? Like you know how to build tension, but maybe you're not really sure how to make sure that's grounded in a concrete setting. So everyone is contributing in the way that they know best. So that comes on the creative side. But when it comes to the int, there's also kind of internal fact checking, right? So as we mentioned before, we always use trusted sources. We want to make sure our research and the data that we have is always grounded in proper sources and reality. But there are always times when once we start projecting 10, 15 years into the future, someone will bring in a machine that they think will be able to fix this little problem, and someone else will go, actually, it couldn't do that, right? Or that we can already do that now. In 10 to 15 years, we're going to be far beyond those capabilities. What might that bring? And in terms of editing, which we won't be able to do today, of course, what the exquisite corpse allows us to do is actually go back and figure out what are the weaknesses in the story, right? Because sometimes when you keep writing, you realize, oh, actually, that was a plot hole, that was a weakness that we need to go back and kind of start rejiggering and kind of fixing around. So that's how we use it in the classroom setting. And obviously, as Jim mentioned, we have 12 weeks to do that. We have, 22 minutes to do that here. So we're going to try to give you a sweet and short version of that where we'll brainstorm, and then we'll start to think about the characters, the location, the time, because that really matters, of course, but we'll get to that as a little bit later on. But right now I want to kind of go into a format that we use when we start creating stories. Now, as we mentioned, as you probably guessed, most, if not all of our officers have never written a fiction story before. So when we say, all right, go be creative, it's terrifying, it's horrifying. And so we try to give them a format called the ABDCE method, which is, if you look at almost any short story or novel, certainly from, I would say, France or the US or, let's say, the Western world, you'll notice that most, if not all of them, follow an ABDCE method. And it's kind of interesting to track those variations, but I'll let Jim talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, as you said that, I was thinking too, we do it all the time and it's still terrifying. So a good way to sort of give a portal into this creativity is something that I discovered when I was reading a biography of a writer I like very much. Her name is Alice Adams. She probably died about 15 years ago. She was a well-known short story writer, also a novelist, published in the New Yorker quite often. And as I was reading a new biography of Alice Adams, I was also reading her collected stories, which is, a writer's sort of vacation. And there was a man, she had an instructor at Stanford University in California. Their MFA program is one of the oldest and one of the best in the United States. Ivor Winters, and he really boiled it down to something that seemed so deceptively simple, I thought, this can't be. So he would give his students this model that we call ABDCE. Action, background, development, climax, and end. Action, background, development, climax, and end. And as I was, the Alice Adams biography introduced me to that, and then I was reading all her stories, I thought, well, sure enough, there it is in almost all the stories. Not nearly as simple as I'm making it sound. It isn't necessarily a linear approach to constructing a story, but all those elements have to be there. So when we give that to the officers, at least they can say, okay, I get it. I can start with what's my action and then go from there. So with ABDCE is what we'll be working on today. So a couple of key things that we have. We've mentioned strategic foresight, which is why we had approval from on high to even tackle this here, because the French government has accorded a lot of weight to that notion. And then the idea of creative collaboration, which is, again, is something of a strange concept too. So let's give you now, those are just sort of the theory in a nutshell. And we'll tell you how we recently put this into practice. So we were doing something for a corporate entity, and we wanted to create 2 original FICINT pieces. So remember what I said earlier about the form, how they can be so free in form. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the int that we decided to use, and Nefkote will tell you about how we each crafted those into the FICINT stories. So, and this is a model for how we'd like it to work today when we start to brainstorm in just a moment. So our topic was going to be climate change, and then we just start drilling down. And in any story, certainly stories that are aiming to be 5 or 7 pages, given the 10 or 12 weeks we have, this is very important. You can really only effectively put into a story 5 or 6 subtopics. So, if we say we're going to write a story about climate change, you'll just be paralyzed. Where can you go with that? So you have to start drilling down and asking questions. So we went through this brainstorm, just the two of us. And this is how it proceeded. So from climate change to extreme heat. From extreme heat, we started to think about, okay, where? We decided on the American Southwest. Let's look at Phoenix. Why? Again, we go back to what we know today. Phoenix, which is already suffering 100-day runs of 100-degree temperature days, already has instituted an Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. That's pretty interesting that they've already done that. So again, we think, okay, 10, 15 years down the road, what might that look like in Phoenix or elsewhere? Then we start to think about other interesting things we want to incorporate. So Phoenix, as many places, all places do, have increasingly aging older populations. Started to think, okay, heat, how do we humanize that? So again, it has that greater impact compared to a memo or a white paper. And we started thinking about, what about the impact of extreme heat on everyday objects? So sidewalks that become unwalkable, dangerous for pets, playground equipment that children are burning themselves on. And I guess we should stop and say, we're not always in the happiest of places when we talk FICINT. This always comes up. But what we want to say is, though, we're not trying to scare anyone, but then again, perhaps we are, because some of these things, the things that are of greatest concern to us, are of concern to us because they're rather alarming now. And if we cast into the future about how much more alarming they could be, the idea is to sort of engage and incite action now, so that those stories, they don't eventuate, they don't end up being these horrific sort of narratives. So hot sidewalks, cars, playgrounds. Then we started to think again, demographics, the aging population. If someone were to fall, lose consciousness and fall on one of those sidewalks, all of a sudden, it was always bad, but now it's horrific given the heat. Then more int. I read recently that by 2050, we expect 8 million fatalities a year related to bacterial and other infections that we presently can treat. Again, by 2050, 8 million casualties a year. And who are most susceptible or very susceptible to those would be burn victims finding themselves in hospitals. So this is how things start to come together. And you have your int, and you're seeing how we try to humanize it. Other things would be other implications of extreme heat. What impact might it have on the mail system and delivery? A big issue we have already is that many people rely on the mail system to get their medicine, rural parts of the United States. And if something is delayed and it's spending an extra day in a FedEx truck that's at 115 degrees, there are repercussions for that. In the background, we thought, when would we set this? So in a near future, Nafkoti will talk a bit more about how we chose to fictionalize this intelligence. But in the background, there are the two things that I think were quite significant. We wanted to talk about climate change as a reality, but you want to be very careful of what we call an info dump. You can't have a paragraph just saying, here's all the information. So one way we wanted to talk about the increase in weather events, we came up rather brilliantly, I must say, with a new way to name storms. So what are we saying when we do that? We're telling the reader that the current way we have of naming storms, which is giving them, there's a list of names A through Z, and then you start over again. But there have been recent seasons, hurricane seasons, where we've exhausted that name. So just by coming up with a new way to name storms, you're telling the reader in the background, this is why this would have to happen. We also wanted to, this is a bit of our military training, I guess, we wanted to think about a malign actor who might choose or try to weaponize extreme heat. So while the story is going on, the people in Phoenix at the Office of Heat Mitigation are wondering if what's happening in New Orleans and Miami might be related, where they're having problems with the grid. So if you start to think about, it's 110 degrees in Phoenix for 14 days in a row, and suddenly the AC is out. That would be of interest to some malign actor for reasons that should be obvious. So that was the int that we were talking about. Again, based on today's science, current trends. So we're not casting out as far out as 2050, what I said about those hospital infections, but that's a trend today, so we can see where that trend is going. Now, in terms of form, Nafkote will tell you a bit more about how we both chose to create FICINT scenarios based on that int.
So both of us chose extremely different formats, and I think what will be clear is that the different formats help you either dig deeper, kind of closer in the nearer future, versus kind of forecasting a bit further out into the distant future. So I'll start with Jim's story, which was in the format of a newspaper article. So already when I see a story that's written as a newspaper article, as a reader, I'm thinking, whatever is going to be in this piece is of national import, right? That this is not going to be just an intimate short story. This is something that has apparently had so much kind of weight and severity that multiple people must be told about it, right? Media outlets have picked it up. So already you're giving the story a sense of authority. What a newspaper article also allows you to do, of course, is have different testimonials, just what we have in the newspaper article that Jim wrote. We're able to kind of get to know a few different characters from different states, which is important because, as we've talked about, this is not just an issue about one city having a problem, this is a grid, right? What happens when a major region of a country is affected by climate phenomena? How do we help those states deal with that within their populations? It also allows us to kind of bring in a bit of the nomenclature and the processes that we want to use to demonstrate how serious this problem has gotten. So Jim mentioned the naming protocol for the hurricanes. In the article, in the story, it's not new paragraph. Hurricane season has become so terrible, now there's a new naming protocol, right? The names are just being used, and you as a reader are expected to pick up on that. And what that's supposed to do, and what that does, I think, in this article is it gives you a sense of this looming dread, right? That these people are talking about something they're not really sure of, because many of the people being interviewed are not experts. They're lay people who are experiencing the consequences. And there's this feeling of, what could be happening? What are we going to do? Right? So a newspaper article, journalism as a format gives you the chance to look at a more distant future. Whereas my short story is much more, it's a closer future, and it focuses on one family. It's an older, a daughter in her 20s. She's come back home to live with her elderly father. Her restaurant where she works has closed down because of the excessive heat. There's no way to have patrons. So there's also the issue of unemployment. And her father is diabetic, and he's waiting for his medication to be shipped to him. But the medication, as Jim was talking about, the postal system has been delayed. Medication, what happens to it if it stays at the, you were saying a FedEx truck, it could be at the postal depot for, let's say, weeks, months. So it's not only the delay in terms of health, but it's also what happens to that medication when it finally arrives at its destination, right? It's of lower efficacy. So what I want to kind of also drill down on here is that if you think about it, there's so much that we've both talked about, right? We're talking about healthcare, which especially in the US, we all know is already a fraught issue, right? So, and frankly, it's already kind of a dystopian issue. Imagine in 10 to 15 years where we're going to be. So there's healthcare, there's the postal system, right? So how we communicate with each other, we bring in communications. There's medical. There's also how we treat different populations. So we've got demographics, we've got population estimates. We are dealing with transport. We're dealing with infrastructures. And we're also then dealing with corporations versus local, state governments versus national governments. At some point, we saw this already in Texas when corporations were able to jack up the prices of certain electricity functions, and the state could do nothing about it, right? So there are all these problems are being encapsulated in short stories that are, I think both of us, about 6 pages each. So how do you make sure that all those ideas are included without it feeling like you're inundated with all of these data points, right? And that's where storytelling can kind of smooth the gaps and help us as readers find the questions that we need to start asking by the end of the story.
So strategic foresight creative collaboration, and yes, again, for want of a better word, messaging. But the process that we're now going to guide you through, I like to think of as a more organic messaging. An inorganic messaging would be when you start with what you want to convey and work backwards, which for me is a pretty good definition of propaganda as well. So we want to arrive at something a bit more organically, but the hope is to engage the audience and therefore spur the audience to action, awareness as at a minimum, but also action. So we're going to ask you guys now to wake up, because this is that afternoon sort of lull. We're going to need you guys to sort of shout out too, because here comes some brainstorming. And one of the ways I think it's interesting to conceive of, the first thing we want to do is brainstorm what topic do you want to try to create this scenario. Let me say too, think of it this way. Think of it more like a film scenario. So even if you give it to us in present tense sentences, what would we all be seeing jointly on a film? Again, very different from what we do over 12 weeks here when it's writing and revision, etc. So think of it as a film scenario. Because one of the things we've noticed too, because we've been asked to do this, the int can be anything. We did an event recently where the int was really focused more on construction and geopolitical sort of concerns. So FICINT is a portable model that can be done short-term, an afternoon's workshop, long-term, 12 weeks of sessions. And the int, the FICINT, the principles remain in place, but the int can be anything. But here we will sort of keep it a bit more general. So perhaps conceive of the big issue we're going for now. As we said with our stories, it was climate change, and then we took it from there. Think of it perhaps as a traditional graph. On the x-axis, you might have your topics. On the y-axis, you might do 5, 10, 15 years. And then think about plotting things on that graph based on when you think they will be of primary concern. Some things are more immediate than other things. All of it, though, is based on the int, or the data that we know now. Okay? So our scribe is at the ready here. So in order to guide this process a bit more carefully, consider starting with one of these 3 topics. If you guys have consensus on a different topic, fine. But in the interest of time, we were thinking to present you with these 3 topics: climate change, transhumanism, and communications. Communications, perhaps it's a subtopic that's of interest to us, are the seabed cables, where so much is happening with those now. So first order of business, and again, we'll do this as it feels organic. We can't necessarily proceed A, B, D, C, E straight through, but we need to come up with what we're going to be, the int we're going to be using. Then we will, when it feels appropriate, we will say, okay, who's our protagonist? Where are they from? Where does it take place? Okay, we want to avoid things like we see on movies or Netflix series where a date line just crawls across the screen, you know, Arlington 2050 or something. We want more subtlety than that. So we have a lot of pieces of this puzzle to put into place. But this morning, it was very interesting to see because safe to assume this is perhaps new to most of you. And I hope that you will see that as these things start to fill the whiteboard, the story sort of starts to show itself. And that's a pretty cool thrill about the creative process. And we'll also tell you what will fall away, what will become primary, who the character should be, why are they from this place, why are they this age and not that age. Okay, so let's go. Perhaps climate change, perhaps transhumanism, perhaps communications. Or are there other ideas, other big ideas?